Welcome to Joy, Love, and Abundance, designed to lift up and explore the people, organizations, and experiences that create a more joyful, loving, and abundant world. Join hosts Rodney Eric Lopez, Patrice Tanaka, and Cyrus Weve as they share stories and insights that will inform and inspire you. Enjoy today's broadcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Joy, Love, and Abundance. So glad that you could be with us. I'm Cyrus Webb, excited to be here with, of course, my two friends, Patrice Tanaka and Rodney Eric Lopez, for another great episode. You know, guys, we were just talking about before the show began, I was sharing with you all about such a great response we've gotten from our audience in Mississippi, and I want to thank our audience at WYED 94.1 FM for listening to us on the radio dial, but also letting me know here locally what your thoughts are, and we want you to continue to share that. But I was sharing with the two of you that people really like that conversation, our honesty and our openness about what we were feeling. And Patrice, I was saying to you that it was not until last week's show that I thought about the fact I have never had this conversation with you about where you're from, about your nationality. It never has come up. I have to ask you, Patrice, to get things started. Does it surprise you that we've known each other now a decade? Does that surprise you we've never had that conversation?
Not really, because I know that I've asked you about your experiences of growing up Black in Mississippi, and from what, you told me, that really wasn't the lens through which you looked at your life, and, because your neighborhood was very mixed. So that kind of satisfied my kind of curiosity about that. I didn't even think that you didn't ask me, only because Tanaka, my last name, is a very common Japanese name. So I just assumed that you knew that I was Japanese American. It's like the fourth most common name in Japan.
Gotcha. Anyway. And Rodney, I want to bring you into this, and we're going to talk about the topic we were just talking about being seen, because this is such an interesting thing. When I first met Rodney and I, for those on the radio side and those listening to the podcast, Rodney and I, even though we have a great rapport here on this show, we've only met each other in person one time. we met because of Patrice in New York. Rodney, this conversation, what was it like for you to kind of think about last week's episode? And I know we spent a lot of time talking about, of course, the tragedy in Atlanta, but what was it like for you to kind of think about this whole idea of race and ethnicity and hate that comes around it sometimes?
It's such a pressing and present thing to be thinking about all the time. In fact, there are times when I might even think, it's the only thing, because so much of our country's history and so much of what happens in the news today is centered around race, and so you really can't escape the conversation. And so I think that unfortunately, there's we see too many things in our media around how race is a problem and how race shows up in, particularly against people of color, how, whether it's voting rights, whether it's violence, whether it's discrimination, whether it's housing or issues with the police. It's difficult. It's difficult to constantly be looking at the tragedy of race in this country when we still haven't had the important national conversation we've had to have, I think, around race, particularly around Black people and historically how this country has treated African Americans and indigenous people. And yet there is still so many wonderful things that are happening around conversations in race. And I think it's just work that continues to need to be done. And so I'm glad that we have spaces like this in this show to explore a little bit, whether it is good things that are happening in our communities, but also work that continues to need to be done. And so I'm glad that we have an agenda for this show, and then sometimes we can throw that agenda out and talk about what's pressing for us right now.
Yeah, and that's what I love about it. So with that being said, I mean, it's hard to believe now we've been doing this show. I mean, we're going on, 3 months now that we've been able to be a part of this. And I have given the credit where it is rightly due, and that is to Patrice Tanaka for the idea for this show. I had not thought about putting together anything like this before. It was Patrice's idea. So, Patrice, you were sharing with the two of us briefly about how you kind of came up with the idea of us. For our audience out there, let them know what you were hoping to do in bringing us all together and what you hope would come out of that from our different perspectives.
Yeah, well, I love you, Cyrus, and I've always wanted to do something with you. And then I thought about it. You know, you're Black, I'm Asian, and in order to have a richer diversity, I thought, it'd be good to have, like, Latina or a Latino. And then, of course, I thought of Rodney. I wanted to have people who I knew would all get along with one another, would be, up for the journey, and that it would be fun to get together with once a week and just have a conversation. And Rodney was actually the executive director of a nonprofit board that I was and still am a trustee of. And so this is kind of, and he was great, we love Rodney, but he had to relocate to Rhode Island and had to leave us. So this is kind of my way of just being able to keep in touch with someone I adore, Rodney, and be able to, have him participate in our conversation. Also, I knew that Rodney really, was looking for the opportunity to do something like this. I thought, this could be kind of a win-win-win for all of us, right?
Yeah.
And so there you have it.
Well, I want to say this, and you guys feel free to chime in. I have found, and again, I did a lot of soul searching after last week's show, and this may sound like a strange thing to say, but I realized how I'm 45 years old. I realize how, in many senses, I have been in a very unique bubble in my life, which makes no sense considered geographically where I'm from. From Mississippi. It's not like I grew up in a big metropolitan city, and that is looked at as being very forward leaning. And my experience here, I think, and growing up in the family, I have to throw that in there too, where my mother literally said to us growing up, we don't see race. My grandmother would say to me, we don't see race. We're all God's children. We don't see race. And I grew up with that, not just hearing it, but kind of making that a part of who I was. I had friends of mine growing up that some looked like me, some didn't. And it honestly never came up in conversations. With my quote-unquote white friends, we never talked about what is it like being white or what is it like being black or, other friends of other nationalities. So a lot of what's happening today is very odd to me because it seems so backwards in many respects of all the, the fact that we have to talk about respecting people of other races, of other nationalities, of, it seems so crazy to me that these are now conversations in 2021. Rodney, I'm curious, and Patrice, definitely feel free to chime in. Does it feel like to you we're going backwards in many respects when it comes to the issues of race and acceptance?
I don't know, Cyrus. It's a hard question because I think that, the narrative around race changes depending on whom you're talking to. I think different people have different perspectives. Number one, based on just what kind of the race of the person who's talking. Also, I think there are certainly generational aspects to this conversation, but there's a narrative that says that race relations in the United States has improved, or that racism isn't as overt as it once was, that the gains of the civil rights movement have manifested in better outcomes for Black, Brown, Asian people, in this country. And there are certainly some metrics that certainly point to that, and that can't be denied. But when you look at some of the acts of violence that take place, and you look at the statistics of where of the the social and economic conditions under which Black and Brown and Asian people live in this country, sort of writ large, have things really changed, and I think that's a real conversation that needs to be had when the kind of violence that takes place against someone like George Floyd or Eric Garner or Breonna Taylor, we're in 2021 and we are still talking about this kind of violence taking place in Black communities. It is disheartening. It feels like we are stepping backwards in time. When we look at this the national conversation around voting rights, particularly in Black communities, it feels like we're taking a step backwards in time. So I don't know. It's a very difficult question, and it's one that needs to be continued to be addressed.
Yeah. Well, I think if you had a former president like we did, who incited, racial injustice and prejudice, and seemed to stand with white supremacists at every turn, that really made it safer for people who were racist or who had racist tendencies or who were white supremacists to be emboldened and to speak up and to act out. And we're dealing with the repercussions of all of that. And now it's being perpetrated on the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities just because, the former president talked about the China virus and Kung flu. It just takes a little bit to have people turn on a group, because we're all, our history has been one of, looking for a scapegoat, looking for the group responsible for the predicament we're all in. So, we're living in a much more polarized America than we were 4 years ago. It's not to say that, racism and white supremacy wasn't a problem then, but if you're invited to come out and act out, it can, ignite and become a really big problem, as it has, where we've seen that there's 3,800 incidences of anti-Asian violence just in the past year, and another study that showed that in the 15 largest cities with the largest Asian American populations, hate crimes against Asians have increased 150%, even though the overall hate crime in all of those 15 cities actually declined 7%. So, it's the Asian Americans who are now, the focus of a lot of anger right now.
Yeah. Patrice, having that show with you guys last week, which is why I'm so glad we've been doing this show, and so glad that other people are enjoying it as well. And I definitely encourage them to continue to share their thoughts. For those who are just tuning in on the radio side, you're listening to Joy, Love, and Abundance. I'm joined, of course, you just heard there from Patrice Tanaka. Before that, we had Rodney Eric Lopez, and I'm Cyrus Webb. We're just talking about the response from you guys on the radio side to last week's show, where we were talking about, of course, the tragedy that happened in Atlanta, but also prejudice and hatred. And it made me just really self-reflect, as I try to do every day, honestly. I realize I'm a very quirky individual. And I also realize, and I have had it said to me, honestly, that I am in some ways part of the problem. Because, especially like a year like 2020, where there was so much racial unrest among Black people with police, I did not use my platform to really talk about it, because I was afraid it would be seen as being an opportunist, because I didn't feel like I had anything of value to add to the conversation, if that makes sense, because I couldn't speak from a personal experience, And I wanted to be very careful not to just give a amplified voice to things. I mean, anger. I think anger being expressed is important, but to be able to do it respectfully. And I just didn't feel like Conversations, my platform, was the place to do it. And I got some heat for that last year for not talking about it more. But Patrice, I think when things hit home, when you kind of feel a connection to things, I think it makes you feel like you're supposed to say something, right? That you're, you even was sharing with us on another platform about you've been getting an influx of invites and how does that feel? Because for myself, I've often said to people, and I'm curious to see you guys' thoughts about this. I have never felt like I could speak for the Black community because, for one, I don't see the Black community as being monolithic. And again, my experience being so different than a lot of people's experience, I would never want people to think I'm diminishing someone else's story because my story is so different. So I was curious, Patrice, when you were getting all of that last week about requests, and did you feel as though people looked at you as the voice?
Yeah, and it felt very uncomfortable because, as I think I mentioned to you, I grew up in Hawaii where Asians were in a majority. So I never felt like a minority, and in fact, I never thought about my ethnicity at all. Even when I moved to New York City in my early 20s, I never felt like I was a minority, even though I was definitely a minority, moving to New York City. And, my ethnicity hasn't been first and foremost the thing that, the way that I look at the world. If anything, it's really being a woman that makes me look at, gender equity and, violence against women. I'm more concerned about that. And so my own Asian American and Japanese American identity are much lower on the rung. And frankly, in the past year, I co-chaired this Diversity Action Alliance for the PR industry, and our focus since George Floyd has really been on, anti-Black, violence and racism, and that's where my focus actually has been in recent years, focused on Black and Brown communities. So the shootings in Atlanta just kind of stunned me because I knew there was anti-Asian violence that had been happening over the past year, one-off things. But 6 women were murdered, were targeted, and, killed. And that got my attention. And that forced me to think about being an Asian American woman in New York City, where I've lived now for 40 years. And, all of a sudden, I'm feeling very vulnerable just walking what I call the mean streets of Manhattan. And I'm talking about the Upper East Side and Fifth Avenue, because I don't know if an assault is going to happen. And in fact, New York had the highest incidence of anti-Asian hate crimes in 2020. And so I have a very heightened sense of anxiety about being an Asian American woman in New York City. And whereas before I never thought about being Asian or an Asian American woman, now I'm thinking about it, unfortunately.
Gotcha. Rodney, when you were first introduced to me by Patrice, when you and I first met in New York, because of, and again, some people would look at it different ways. Again, just me being Cyrus Weve as I am, I never thought about anything about you as other than, you're working with dancing classrooms. As Patrice had introduced me to at the time. So, what about this conversation for you? Have you found, I know you've used, I didn't tell you about this, actually. I don't even think I told Patrice about this, but I know after Parkland, you gave a very impassioned op-ed about that time and gun violence. And it really, to me, said so much about you, and I think it brightened the way my worldview is. It brightened this and made it a us against the problem rather than us against us. So I'm curious as to your thoughts about this conversation, Rodney, in that respect of, I was talking to Patrice about being the voice. What do you think about that pressure that some feel to kind of try to have to speak and explain for everyone?
It's an important question, particularly for anyone like yourself, with really any of us with a platform to speak of. So as far as my experience is, I don't think I can ever divorce I've never been able to divorce my life and my existence from my race, my skin color, my ethnicity. It's always been a part of who I am. Certainly in my formative years, it wasn't something I thought about deeply, but certainly as I became a teenager and began to leave the confines of my home and my family and begin to be juxtaposed next to people of other races and ethnicities, now all of a sudden you have a heightened sense of who you are. And then you start thinking more, at least I started thinking more politically about my race and my ethnicity and my relationship to the dominant culture, to whiteness, and to and what does that mean, and then what does that mean for my larger community? So I have always, I should say, certainly since my adolescence, have thought deeply about race and have had a very racialized worldview. And when I think about your comment about your platform and stands you may or may not have taken, in the last year, I think it's an interesting question. I don't think one person should ever be in the position of having to speak for an entire community. I think that's a burden that no one should have to bear, because there is no one Black community, no one, Latino community, no one Asian community. There's multiple perspectives and ideas, and yet there are people who are spokespeople for one reason or another. So do you have to speak for the Black community just because you're a Black person? I think that's something you have to decide. But can you use your platform as a space to create dialogue, to invite multiple voices and perspectives, to advance the conversation of race in a healthy way? I think that's a laudable thing. I think that's a great goal. And so I think that's something you will continue to deal with and examine as you look at how you want to use conversations and the other media platforms that you're a part of, because the sad part is that this will not be the last racial incident. This will not be the last racial moment in this country. And so, how can we use our collective platforms and voices and to advance a more holistic conversation and dialogue that allows us to heal? I think that's our responsibility whenever we can.
I agree, and I want to say one thing about the Asian American community in particular. We've been historically and culturally very silent about the injustices directed towards us. Even, the Japanese Americans being incarcerated during World War II, I never heard about it until I was in college, and that's because that World War II generation was so ashamed of it, they never spoke about it. So it was never told. It was never in history books. We didn't even know. And that same kind of suck it up and just soldier on has been the way that the Asian American community has dealt with things. But we can no longer be silent. And I don't like being the spokesperson for the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, but people have been asking me to speak because I speak about different things, not about this. So I feel compelled to say yes, because we can no longer remain silent, because then we're invisible, and the hate crimes against us are invisible too. I've had people commenting on my social media that, are you sure it was a hate crime after 6 Asian women got shot, killed in Atlanta? They're asking me questions like this, and they're even saying to me, well, I think it's racist to say that it was an anti-Asian hate crime. So
oh my goodness.
I'm speaking up. Yes, I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, it is. I think
like
that's why I'm so. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Rodney.
Thanks. I want to just say, this past week, one of the things we were talking about in preparing for this conversation, even though this conversation has gone in a direction I didn't think it was going in.
Right.
But we talked about one of the things we were considering this, before was, what have we reflected on, right, in the last week since reflecting on the violence in Atlanta. And so one of the things that I was reflecting on was this organization. It's a very new organization called Liberated SEL, which is run by Dina Simmons, Dr. Dina Simmons, who was formerly at the Center for Emotional Intelligence. And so she started this new group on liberated social emotional learning. And she had this wonderful post this week on Instagram called How to Hold Space for the Violence in Atlanta. And I think that even though this was written specifically for what took place in Atlanta, I think it's a wonderful roadmap for how we should deal with any kind of sort of traumatic experience that takes place in a racialized setting. And I want to just name these 7 things really quickly, which is these 7 steps. And the steps are as follows. Number 1, acknowledge what happened. Number 2, invite students. She's talking about in a school context. Invite students to reflect silently or in their journals about what happened, but any of us can do this, not just students. Number 3, create space for students to explore their feelings together or with a trusted adult. Number 4, share healing-centered resources. 5, invite students to brainstorm solutions for addressing AAPI hate and for supporting and protecting AAI people in their communities. Ask students what they need to heal. And then 7, incorporate a deep breathing exercise focused on healing. And I think that while these steps were designed for a classroom setting, I think that, number 1, that's very important because we need to be working with our young people to process these moments. And because they seem to be flying at us so quickly and so furiously, and because the mental health of our students has been under attack since the pandemic began, there's even more urgency for us to find ways to cope, process, and heal from these kinds of things. But I think it's not just students. I think it's any of us need these spaces to process what's happened, talk about what's happened, and then begin to both seek justice and to focus on personal traumatic healing. So, or healing from trauma, I should say. So, just based on the heels of what Patrice said, in terms of the conversation she's been having this week around this topic, we can't forget that even talking about these things can be violent, self-violent. Can re-traumatize us if we're not paying attention to processing these feelings. And I think that goes across the board beyond just what happened in the last week.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say this
Rodney.
too, thank you, Rodney. As we wrap up here, and we definitely thank our audience for being with us, we will be remiss in not mentioning, of course, the victims of the mass shooting in Colorado as well on Monday, March the 22nd, where 10 people lost their lives, including a local on-duty police officer. So again, just know everyone out there to continue to be able to do your part to lead with love, with joy and abundance. Try to be able to do what you can to make a difference. And Rodney and Patrice, I really appreciate you all being a part of this really important conversation with us today, and definitely looking forward to next week, where I know we will continue to be able to do our part to shed some light in the world.
Yes. Thank you, Cyrus.
Absolutely. Thanks, Cyrus.
And we thank your audience for tuning in to another great segment of Joy, Love, and Abundance. Until next time, you all make it a great one. We will be back with you all soon. Take care.